There is a black stone sitting in a museum in Paris right now that should terrify you. It is made of basalt. It is roughly 4 feet tall. It was carved nearly 3,000 years ago by a king who believed his god had helped him murder thousands of people. And he wanted the world to know about it. He wanted to make sure that long after his body turned to dust, his god's name would echo across centuries. That god's name was Chemosh, the king's name was Mesha, and the people they belonged to were the Moabites. That stone, scholars call it the Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in biblical history. It was found in 1868 in the ruins of ancient Dibon, a city in what is now the Kingdom of Jordan. And when researchers translated it, they discovered something astonishing. This stone, carved by an enemy of Israel, confirmed the biblical record almost point by point. It mentioned the God of Israel by name. It mentioned the tribe of Gad. It mentioned the king of Israel, Omri. And it described, in its own words, from the perspective of Moab's own king, the brutal wars fought across the Jordan plateau. But there is one line on that stone that stays with you long after you've read it. Mesha writes about taking the vessels of Yahweh, the sacred objects of the God of Israel, and dragging them before the face of Chemosh. Think about what that means. A pagan king, a pagan god, the sacred objects of Israel displayed as trophies before an idol carved from stone. That is who the Moabites were. And today, we're going to find out everything about them, where they came from, what they believed, what they did to Israel, and what happened to them in the end. Because the story of Moab is not just an ancient history lesson, it is one of the darkest, most disturbing, and most theologically complex stories in all of Scripture. A story that begins in a cave, moves through child sacrifice and spiritual corruption, reaches a climax that still confounds biblical scholars today, and ends with a silence so complete it feels like judgment. Stay with me. Because the Moabites are not who you think they are. The story of Moab begins with fire, specifically with the fire that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah. You know that story. The cities destroyed, the sulfur raining from heaven, Lot and his daughters escaping while everything behind them turned to ash, Lot's wife looking back, becoming a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 is one of the most dramatic chapters in the entire Bible, and most people stop there, with the destruction, with the horror of God's judgment. But the chapter keeps going, and what comes next is something the Sunday school curriculum tends to skip entirely. After the destruction, Lot and his 2 daughters are living in a cave in the mountains near the ruins. They are the only survivors they know of. The cities are gone, the region is desolate, and Lot's daughters, watching the landscape of their entire world smoldering in the distance, come to a conclusion. They believe there are no men left on earth. Genesis 19:31 records the older daughter saying exactly that. There is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. And so, on 2 consecutive nights, each daughter makes her father drunk with wine, lies with him, and becomes pregnant. The older daughter names her son Moab, which in Hebrew is connected to the phrase "from father." He is the ancestor of an entire nation. His half-brother Ben-Ami becomes the ancestor of the Ammonites. This is how Moab begins, not in glory, not in covenant, in a cave smelling of smoke with a drunk old man who has just watched everything he knew burn to the ground, fathering children with his own daughters. If you were writing a novel, this would be foreshadowing. The seed of a nation planted in incest, in desperation, in the shadow of divine judgment. The Moabites were born in catastrophe's wake, and their entire history would carry that mark. Now, God is not cruel. He is not a cosmic scorekeeper who punished an entire people for the circumstances of their origin. The Bible makes clear that Moab became what it chose to become. The origin is context, not condemnation. But that context matters. Because when you understand where Moab began, you begin to understand the particular darkness that followed them through every century of their existence. The territory of Moab occupied a high plateau east of the Dead Sea. If you look at a map of modern Jordan, you are looking at ancient Moab. The land was fertile by ancient Near Eastern standards. The tableland produced grain. The pastures sustained large flocks. The Moabite stone itself refers to the rich agricultural wealth of the region. The people who settled there built cities, developed sophisticated culture, spoke a language nearly identical to biblical Hebrew, and, crucially, they knew about the God of Israel. They were not isolated pagans who had never heard of Yahweh. They were neighbors. They shared ancestry with Abraham through Lot. They occupied land that bordered Israel. And they chose Chemosh. Chemosh. That name appears 19 times in the Bible, and every single mention is darker than the last. He is called the abomination of Moab in 1 Kings 11:7. The prophet Moses called the Moabites the people of Chemosh in Numbers 21:29. In a song that carried the weight of lamentation, "Woe to you, O Moab! You are destroyed, O people of Chemosh." Even in defeat, Chemosh defined them. He was their identity, their patron, their explanation for everything. What did Chemosh demand? Here is where it gets dark. The ancient Near East was full of gods who required sacrifice. Most of them were satisfied with grain, with wine, with animals. Chemosh was not always satisfied with those things. The most chilling evidence of what Chemosh sometimes required comes from 2 Kings 3:27, a verse we will return to in detail, where a Moabite king, in a moment of desperate military crisis, kills his own firstborn son and burns him as an offering on the city wall. And the text says something happened after that, something that even the Israelite army could not explain. We will get to that moment. But for now, understand. This was a God built for catastrophe. A God whose power, his worshippers believed, was most fully activated in the moment of maximum sacrifice. A God fed by the worst grief a human being could offer. In that sense, Chemosh was a perfect match for a nation born in the shadow of Sodom's destruction. A nation that began in loss and would continue pouring loss onto altars made of stone. If you think this story is already disturbing, you haven't seen anything yet. Let me take you to the plains of Moab. The year is approximately 1406 BC. Israel has been wandering the wilderness for 40 years. Moses is old. The Promised Land is visible from the eastern side of the Jordan River. The people of Israel are camped in the region, and Balak, king of Moab, is watching them, and what he sees terrifies him. Numbers 22:2-3 tells us exactly what Balak felt. Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was in great dread of the people because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel. Balak was not a man who lacked resources. He was the king of a powerful nation. He had an army, he had walls, but he had also watched Israel defeat kingdoms that should have been able to stop them. And Balak, who understood power in terms of the spiritual forces that backed military force, made a decision. He would hire a professional, a cursor, a man whose words were reputed to carry supernatural weight in the world of ancient spiritual warfare. His name was Balaam. He was not a Moabite. He came from a region far to the north near the Euphrates River. But his reputation had spread across the ancient Near East as a man who dealt in blessings and curses. Numbers 22:6 records Balak's pitch to him perfectly. "For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." What follows is one of the most bizarre, theologically rich, and surprisingly comedic passages in the entire Old Testament. God intervenes in the journey. A donkey speaks. An angel appears with a drawn sword. Balaam, the man hired to curse Israel, ends up delivering some of the most stunning prophetic blessings over Israel ever recorded in Scripture, including, in Numbers 24:17, a prophecy that generations of later interpreters would connect to the coming of the Messiah. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. But let's slow down on the Balaam narrative, because the details are extraordinary, and they tell us something essential about how the Moabites understood spiritual reality. Balak didn't just ask Balaam to curse Israel from a distance. He brought him to 3 separate high places, 3 different vantage points overlooking the Israelite camp, and attempted the curse 3 times. 3 altars built at each location, 7 bulls and 7 rams sacrificed at each site. The number 7 throughout the ancient Near East was the number of completion, of divine fullness. Balak was throwing everything he had at this. He was performing the maximum possible ritual investment in the most sacred possible locations, hoping that from some angle, from some position, the curse would catch. At the first location, Bamoth Baal, the high places of Baal, Balaam opened his mouth and blessed Israel instead of cursing them. Numbers 23:8. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? Balak's jaw must have dropped. He redirected Balaam to a second location, the field of Zophim on the top of Pisgah, and tried again. Same result. Balaam blessed Israel again, this time with even greater force, delivering the famous oracle of Numbers 23:19. God is not man, that he should lie, or a son of man, that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? And Balak tried a third time, the top of Pur, and this time Numbers 24:2 records something significant. And Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. The Spirit of the God of Israel, falling on a pagan curser hired by the king of Moab. And Balaam delivered his most extraordinary oracle yet, including that messianic star prophecy, including specific predictions of Israel's military victories over the surrounding nations, including a specific word about Moab itself in Numbers 24:17. It shall crush the forehead of Moab. Balak was furious. He struck his hands together, the ancient Near Eastern gesture of absolute dismissal and contempt. He had promised Balaam great honor. He sent him home with nothing. Balak's plan fails completely. He cannot get a curse out of Balaam, and Israel passes through the region without being spiritually defeated. But the Moabites are not done. What happens next in Numbers 25 is the attack that actually worked, not military, not supernatural curse. Something far more ancient and far more effective: seduction. The Moabite women invited the men of Israel to their sacrificial feasts, the feasts honoring Baal of Peor, a regional manifestation of Baal worship that may have overlapped with or incorporated Chemosh. The Israelite men went, they ate, they worshipped, and Numbers 25:3 records the result in a single devastating line. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor. God's anger burned against Israel. A plague broke out. 24,000 people died. The Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 10:8, references this event as a warning to the early church. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Balaam's curse could not touch Israel, but an invitation to a feast could. That is the Moabite strategy laid bare, not frontal assault, infiltration, the corruption of identity, the slow dissolving of boundaries between Israel and the nations around them. And it worked. 24,000 dead, not from Moabite swords, from Israel's own choices. If there is a lesson in this for the modern reader, it is both theological and psychological. The threats that destroy you are rarely the ones that come at you openly. They are the ones that look like dinner invitations. If you are finding this valuable, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves biblical history. The more people find this content, the more we can dig into these stories together. Now, let's keep going. Now we enter the era of the judges. Israel is in the promised land, but unstable, oscillating between faithfulness and apostasy in the cycle that defines the entire book of Judges. And in the third chapter, the Moabites make their move. Eglon, king of Moab. The Bible tells us he was a very fat man, and the Hebrew there is unambiguous. The word translated fat can also mean heavy or large. Eglon formed a coalition with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, crossed the Jordan, and seized Jericho, the city of palms. For 18 years, the children of Israel paid tribute to Eglon. 18 years of Moabite domination over part of the Promised Land. The man God raised up to deliver Israel was named Ehud, a Benjaminite, and here is where the narrative becomes extraordinary. Ehud was left-handed. In the ancient world, that was unusual enough to be worth noting and worth exploiting. He had a double-edged dagger made, roughly 18 inches long, and he strapped it to his right thigh under his clothing. Because he was left-handed, it would be on the side guards would never check. He presented himself to Eglon as the bearer of Israel's tribute. After delivering the payment, he sent away the servants who had come with him and returned alone to the king, telling him he had a secret message from God. Eglon, a man who clearly took spiritual communication seriously, rose from his throne. They were alone in his private upper chamber, and Ehud reached across with his left hand, the unchecked side, drew the blade, and drove it into Eglon's belly. Judges 3:22 records the detail with almost clinical specificity. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. Ehud left without the body being discovered, locked the chamber doors behind him, and was gone before Eglon's servants realized what had happened. The Moabite king lay dead on his floor. The servants waited so long outside the locked doors, assuming he was relieving himself, that Ehud had already escaped, rallied Israel's army, and seized the fords of the Jordan. 10,000 Moabite warriors died at those fords that day. Judges 3:30 closes the account with one of the most efficient summary lines in Scripture. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years of peace, the death of one fat king, one left-handed man with a hidden blade, and a lie about a divine message. But here is the theological complexity the text invites us to sit with. Ehud was clearly God's instrument. The narrative frames him as a deliverer raised up by God, and his method was deception and assassination. This is not a story Scripture frames as morally ambiguous. It presents the killing of Eglon as deliverance. The 80 years of peace that follow are presented as the fruit of Ehud's act. The Moabites and their king were, in the Bible's framing, the agents of oppression. Ehud was the agent of liberation. And the God of Israel, who sees all things, raised up the left-handed man, positioned him in the right chamber at the right moment, and let the fat close over the blade. This is what it meant to be at war with Moab. Not just military strategy, not just political competition, cosmic stakes. The land God had promised to his people under the thumb of people who served Chemosh. And God working through the most unexpected instruments to take it back. But now we must talk about Ruth. Because Moab is not simply a story of darkness, and if we paint the Moabites with only the colors of Chemosh and Eglon and Baal of Peor, we are being dishonest with the text. The book of Ruth exists precisely to complicate the picture, to show us that within a nation defined by its rejection of Israel's God, there were individuals who chose differently. Ruth was a Moabitess. She married an Israelite man named Mahlon, who had come to Moab with his family during a famine. When Mahlon died, Ruth made a choice that defied every natural calculation of self-interest. Her mother-in-law Naomi was returning to Bethlehem, a widow in a foreign land. Ruth's sister-in-law Orpah kissed Naomi and turned back to Moab, and the text does not condemn her for it. It was the logical choice. Go back to your people, go back to your gods, start over. But Ruth said no. Ruth 1:16-17 contains one of the most beautiful declarations of loyalty in all of ancient literature. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also if anything but death parts me and you. She chose Naomi, she chose Israel, she chose Yahweh, and she became the great-grandmother of King David. Think about that genealogical line for a moment. David, the greatest king in Israel's history, the man after God's own heart, the ancestor of Jesus Christ himself, according to the genealogy in Matthew 1, carried Moabite blood, Ruth's blood, the blood of a woman from the nation of Chemosh, who looked at the God of Israel and chose him. God writes these things into genealogies deliberately. There is theology embedded in biology in the Bible's world. The Moabites were not beyond redemption. The blood of a Moabite woman flows in the veins of the Messiah. That is not an accident. That is a declaration. And David himself had a complicated, deeply personal relationship with Moab, one that the text records without fully explaining the emotional weight underneath it. When David was a fugitive from King Saul, running for his life, living in the wilderness and hiding in caves, he brought his parents to Moab for their protection. 1 Samuel 22, 3-4. And David went from there to Mizpeh of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please, let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. David trusted Moab with his parents. Remember, this is the grandson of Ruth. David had family connections there. The Moabites were not simply foreign enemies to him. They were, in some sense, part of his own story. But that makes what happened later even harder to understand. When David became king and began consolidating his kingdom through military campaigns, he turned on Moab. 2 Samuel 8:2 records the campaign with brutal efficiency. And he defeated Moab and measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be kept alive. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. 2/3 killed, 1/3 spared, measured out with a rope on the ground, lying prostrate before the Israelite army. David, whose own great-grandmother was Ruth the Moabitess, who had entrusted his parents to the protection of the Moabite king, presided over the killing of 2 out of every 3 Moabite prisoners. The text gives us no explanation for the severity, no account of what Moab had done to provoke this particular level of response. Scholars have speculated. Some ancient traditions suggest the Moabite king killed David's parents while he was away at war, a story that would explain everything but appears nowhere in the canonical text. We simply don't know. What we know is this: the same nation that sheltered David's parents in his darkest hour became, under his reign, a conquered tributary state. The same blood that flowed through David's grandmother's veins was measured out by rope and divided between life and death. These are the contradictions history produces. These are the kinds of knots that Scripture ties and sometimes does not untie. But we cannot let Ruth soften what comes next, because what comes next is the single most disturbing event in the entire history of Moab. Before we get there, we need to return to the stone, the Moabite stone, because Mesha's own account of his reign, carved before the sacrifice, before the siege, tells us exactly what kind of man he was and exactly what kind of theology he operated within. It helps us understand not just what he did, but why. The inscription on the Mesha stele is 34 lines of text carved in the Moabite alphabet, which is nearly identical to the ancient Hebrew script. When scholars first translated it in the late 1800s, the biblical scholarship world was electrified, because here was a non-Israelite source confirming events recorded in the Bible in astonishing detail. Mesha writes that Chemosh was angry with his land. That was why Israel had dominated Moab during Omri's reign. But then Chemosh's anger subsided, Mesha says, and Chemosh helped him take back everything. He records capturing cities from Israel. He records killing the entire population of one city, men, women, children, and female slaves, and dedicating them to Chemosh. The Hebrew word he uses is the same biblical word for herem, the total destruction, consecrated as a war offering to a god. Mesha is applying the theology of holy war, of total sacrifice, to his victories over Israel. And then, in line 18, he records taking the sacred vessels of Yahweh from the city of Nebo and dragging them before the face of Chemosh in his sanctuary. This is the moment I mentioned at the very beginning, a pagan king pulling the sacred objects of the God of Israel into the presence of his God, holding them up as proof that Chemosh had defeated Yahweh. He was wrong about that, catastrophically wrong, but he didn't know it yet. What the Moabite stone proves, beyond its extraordinary historical confirmation of biblical events, is that Mesha was a man who took the spiritual dimension of warfare completely seriously. He wasn't just a general calculating military advantage. He was a priest-king convinced that the outcome of every battle was determined by which God was more pleased, more fully honored by sacrifice. That the entire world was a spiritual ledger, and the side that paid the most into that ledger won. That is the man who climbed the wall at Kir Hareseth with his son in his arms. The year is approximately 850 BC. King Ahab of Israel has died. His son Joram has taken the throne, and the king of Moab, a man named Mesha, the same man who carved his victories onto that black basalt stone, has been paying Israel a massive annual tribute. 100,000 lambs, 100,000 rams, the wool of 100,000 rams, annually. When Ahab died, Mesha stopped paying. Joram of Israel allied himself with Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom, and they marched against Moab from the south, through the wilderness of Edom, a route Mesha would not have expected. 2 Kings 3 records the campaign. The prophet Elisha, present with the allied forces, prophesied that God would deliver Moab into their hands. The armies dug ditches and water appeared. The Moabites, seeing the water reflect the morning sun, mistook it for blood and concluded the allied kings had turned on each other. They rushed toward the camp to collect spoil and walked into a prepared army. Israel pursued them into the heart of Moab, destroying cities, stopping up wells, cutting down trees, covering fields with stones. They drove Mesha to his last defensive position, Kir Hareseth, his last city, his last walls. He attempted a breakout with 700 swordsmen and failed. He climbed those walls with nowhere left to go, and then he did something that the Bible records without any theological explanation, and that theological silence may be the most unsettling thing in the entire Old Testament. 2 Kings 3:27. Then he took his firstborn son who was to reign in his place and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. His own son, the crown prince, the heir, burned alive as an offering to Chemosh on the top of the city wall, in full view of the besieging army below. And then the text says, "And there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land." Great wrath. The Hebrew word is ketzef. It appears throughout the Old Testament to describe divine anger, the anger that comes from God. The army of Israel, in the moment of complete victory, turned around and went home. Why? Biblical scholars have wrestled with this verse for centuries. Some argue the great wrath refers to human outrage. The allies were so disturbed by the sacrifice they lost their nerve. Some argue it refers to Chemosh, that the ancient Israelites, or the narrative, concedes that the sacrifice activated a real supernatural force. Some argue it refers to Israel's own guilt, that they had pushed a father to this point and something in their conscience broke. The text does not explain. It just records the event and the result. The child burned, the wrath came, the army left. Mesha went back to his stone and recorded a victory. If you believe in the God of the Bible, this verse demands careful theological thought. Because if Chemosh had no power, what was the wrath? And if he did have some form of power, what does that mean for our understanding of the ancient supernatural landscape? The Bible does not treat the gods of the nations as simply myths. It treats them as real entities with real influence, but inferior, utterly inferior to Yahweh. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:20 writes that the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. If the sacrifice of Mesha's son produced something, the text invites us to consider what kind of something it produced, not the power of a God equal to Yahweh. Something darker, something that fed on grief and murder, something that exploited the chaos of the moment to drive away an army that had been promised victory. Mesha burned his son on a wall, and something answered. This is what Chemosh worship looked like at its fullest expression. This is what the Moabites had built their civilization around, an entity that demanded the worst possible grief, an entity that, on at least one recorded occasion, appeared to respond. Pause with me here for a moment. If you have found this content valuable, this is a great moment to subscribe. There's much more ahead. We are about to follow Moab into its final chapters, and what happens to them under the weight of prophetic judgment is extraordinary. Subscribe now. Let's finish this together. The story of Moab cannot be told without talking about what Israel did to itself because of Moab. Because the corruption the Moabites introduced into Israel was not just military or political, it was spiritual, and it had consequences that lasted for centuries. Go back to the plains of Moab. Go back to Baal of Peor. 24,000 dead from a plague. That event was so traumatic that it was referenced repeatedly throughout Israel's later history, but the plague could be survived. What followed in the long term was harder to cure. Solomon, the wisest man in the ancient world, the builder of the temple, the man to whom God appeared twice and offered anything he desired. 1 Kings 11 records what happened in his old age. His foreign wives, and there were many from many nations, including Moabite women, turned his heart toward their gods. 1 Kings 11:7 records the specific moment. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. Chemosh, on a mountain east of Jerusalem, built by the hand of the wisest king who ever lived. Centuries later, when the faithful King Josiah launched his great religious reform, he tore down the high places and defiled them. 2 Kings 23:13 records Josiah destroying the high place that was east of Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab. The Mount of Corruption. That is what the Reformers called it, the mountain where Chemosh had been honored in sight of Jerusalem for generations. This is the legacy of Moab on Israel, not just military pressure, the theological contamination of the nation's center, a high place for a God that fed on children, built by the wisest man in the world, standing within sight of God's own temple for centuries. And now we come to the prophets. Because God did not look at Moab and simply wait. He spoke. Isaiah 15 and 16 contain what scholars call the burden of Moab, a 2-chapter prophetic lament over the coming destruction of Moab that is, in its own strange way, one of the most beautiful and mournful passages in all of prophetic literature. Isaiah writes in the voice of a man grieving, not celebrating. He describes cities in ruins, people fleeing, rivers stained with blood. And then, In a passage that has puzzled interpreters for generations, he seems to grieve for Moab himself. Therefore I weep with the weeping of Jazer for the vine of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh, for over your summer fruit and your harvest the shout has ceased. Isaiah 16:9. Is Isaiah rejoicing over Moab's fall, or weeping? Both. He weeps over the ruin of people who brought ruin on themselves. He grieves the destruction of a people who could have been different. There is no triumphalism in Isaiah 15-16. There is grief, the grief of a God who takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, as Ezekiel 18:23 would later make explicit. Isaiah 16:13-14 closes with a timestamp. This is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past. But now the Lord says, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt, in spite of all his great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. 3 years, the glory of Moab, brought into contempt. But it is Jeremiah 48, an entire chapter dedicated to Moab, that delivers the most comprehensive, devastating prophetic word over any single nation in the entire Old Testament. 47 verses. 47 verses of accumulated judgment falling like stones on a people who had served Chemosh and resisted Yahweh for centuries. Let me read you some of it, because the language is extraordinary. Flee, save yourselves, you will be like a juniper in the desert. Jeremiah 48:6. Moab will be destroyed as a nation because she defied the Lord. Jeremiah 48:42. Your cities will fall in ruins, and no one will live in them. Jeremiah 48:9. But there is a passage in Jeremiah 48 that is almost physically painful to read, because it captures with perfect precision what had gone wrong with Moab from the very beginning. Jeremiah 48:11. Moab has been at ease from his youth and has settled on his dregs. He has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into exile, so his taste remains in him, and his scent is not changed. This is wine-making language. In the ancient world, wine was transferred from vessel to purify it, to separate the wine from the sediment that collected at the bottom, the dregs. A wine that was never poured out, never disturbed, never transferred. It would grow stale. It would taste of its own sediment. It would never become what it could have been. Jeremiah says Moab was like that wine, never disturbed, never emptied, never refined. Moab had lived in relative peace in a plateau east of the Jordan, without the exile that refines nations, without the suffering that forces a people to question who they are and who their God is. Israel went through Egypt. Israel went through the wilderness. Israel went through Babylonian exile. All of that purified something in the covenant people, even when it was agony. Moab sat on its plateau and settled into its dregs. It kept tasting like itself. The God who never challenges you, who only affirms whatever you already want. That God will never purify you. Chemosh asked only for more sacrifice, more blood, more grief. He never asked Moab to be different. He only demanded. And a nation shaped entirely by demands with no invitation toward transformation settles into its sediment and stays there. That is Jeremiah 48:11, a verse about wine that explains everything about why Moab ended the way it did. Jeremiah 48 also contains a moment of extraordinary tenderness, one that mirrors Isaiah's lament, and confirms that the God of the Bible is not a deity who celebrates the destruction of people he created. Jeremiah 48:31-32. Therefore I wail for Moab. I cry out for all Moab. For the men of Kir-Hareseth I mourn. More than for Jazer I weep for you, O vine of Sibmah. Your branches passed over the sea, reached to the sea of Jazer. On your summer fruits and your grapes the destroyer has fallen. Kir-Hareseth, the city where Mesha burned his son on the wall. The God of Israel weeps for that city. He weeps for the children of a man who sacrificed his own child to a God that was not God. The theological complexity of that is staggering. Chemosh demanded everything Moab had and gave back only the illusion of power. Yahweh, the god Chemosh's trophies were supposed to have defeated, wept over Chemosh's city. That contrast does not resolve easily. It should not resolve easily. It should sit with you. Then, and this is the moment in Jeremiah 48 that stops every careful reader. In the final verses of the chapter, after all the judgment, something unexpected happens. Jeremiah 48:47, "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord." I will restore in the latter days. Even here, even in the middle of the most comprehensive prophetic judgment against Moab ever recorded, God leaves a door open, a restoration in the latter days. Whatever that means, and theologians debate it, the God of Israel was not finished with the descendants of Moab the way Chemosh was finished with anything he touched. That contrast is everything. Chemosh fed on his people. Yahweh, even in judgment, left a word of hope at the end. Now we arrive at the question you have been waiting for since we began. Where are the Moabites now? This is not a simple question. Nations don't disappear the way people do. They dissolve, they blend, they leave traces in the land, in the language, in the DNA of the people who came after them. The Moabites, as a distinct, organized political entity, ceased to exist in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, when the Babylonian Empire swept through the region. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns devastated the kingdoms east of the Jordan. The Babylonian historian Josephus, writing centuries later, mentions that Nebuchadnezzar campaigned against Moab, Ammon, and the surrounding nations. The Moabites who survived were absorbed into the Babylonian Empire's population movements, into the Arab tribes pressing in from the south and east, into the general mixing of peoples that defines the ancient Near East in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The last clear biblical reference to the Moabites as a distinct people occurs in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra 9 mentions Moabite women among the foreign wives that Israelite men had taken during the restoration period, women who brought with them the religious traditions of their people. Nehemiah 13:23 records Nehemiah confronting Israelite men who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. This is roughly 450 BC. After this point, the Moabites vanish from the biblical record as a distinct nation, but they didn't vanish from the earth. The land of ancient Moab is today the central and southern portion of the Kingdom of Jordan, cities that appear in the biblical record as Moabite strongholds. Dibon, where the Moabite stone was found. Karak, the ancient Kir-Hareseth, where Mesha made his terrible sacrifice. Medeba, the city that appears on the famous Madaba map. These are all inhabited today. They are Jordanian cities with living populations, minarets instead of high places, cars in streets that were once walked by warriors carrying tribute for King Eglon. Modern genetic research has contributed an additional layer to this story. Studies of DNA populations in the Levant and Jordan confirm deep ancestral continuity between modern populations and the ancient peoples of these regions. The people who live in central Jordan today carry, in some measurable proportion, the genetic legacy of the people who built those cities 3,000 years ago. The descendants of Moab are alive. They go to school, drive cars, argue about politics, drink coffee in the morning. They do not know they carry the blood of the people Jeremiah warned and Isaiah wept for. The Moabite language, a dialect of Northwest Semitic nearly identical to Biblical Hebrew, left traces in place names and personal names that persisted for centuries after the people who spoke it were gone. Archaeologists working in Jordan today still uncover Moabite pottery, Moabite inscriptions, Moabite artifacts. The ancient city of Dibon, where the Moabite stone was found, is now the modern Jordanian town of Dibon. Approximately 4,000 people live there today, over the buried ruins of Mesha's capital. They farm, they raise children, they speak Arabic, not Moabite. They worship in mosques, not at the high places of Chemosh. The land remembers, even when the people have been absorbed beyond recognition. Tel Jalul, identified by some scholars as biblical Medeba, has been excavated multiple times and yielded evidence of continuous occupation from the Iron Age through the Byzantine period. Kirbat al-Mudaina, in the central Moabite plateau, produced one of the few Moabite inscriptions found in a clear archaeological context, confirming that the culture persisted even under Assyrian pressure in the 8th century BC. The physical evidence of Moab is still coming out of the ground in Jordan. Every decade, archaeologists uncover something new, and there is one more layer that deserves mention. When Islamic forces swept through the region in the 7th century AD, they encountered a population that had already been through Babylonian conquest, Persian dominance, Greek cultural pressure, Roman occupation, and Byzantine Christianity. The people of that plateau had absorbed every empire that had passed through it and were still there. Islam was simply the final wave that transformed them into what they are now. But somewhere in the DNA of a Jordanian family in Kerak, which sits directly on the ancient site of Kir Hareseth, where Mesha burned his son on the wall, there is a thread that goes back 3,000 years to a man who chose Chemosh over Yahweh and paid for it in every possible way. And Chemosh is gone. There is no temple to Chemosh in Jordan. There is no priest of Chemosh anywhere on earth. The inscriptions that mention him on the Moabite stone, on a few other ancient artifacts, are the only evidence that he was ever worshipped at all. The altars where children burned are covered in sand and time. The high places that Solomon built have been dust for 2.5 millennia. The God who demanded everything, the most precious thing, the firstborn son, the future, has nothing. He received everything that could be offered to him, and he gave back only a moment of ambiguous military advantage and 3,000 years of silence. Meanwhile, the God of Israel, the god Mesha, dragged sacred objects away from to display before Chemosh's face. That God is worshipped by billions of people across every continent on earth. His name is spoken in cities Mesha could never have imagined existed. His words are translated into thousands of languages. His book, which mentions the Moabites in detail, is the most published text in human history. The contest between Chemosh and Yahweh is not a competition. It never was. It was always Goliath and David, and we know how that ends. But let me bring this all the way home, because the story of Moab is not just ancient history. It is a story about things that are very much alive right now. The Moabite strategy, not the sword, but the feast, is as current as the moment you are living in. The attack that worked on Israel in Numbers 25 was not the frontal assault. It was the invitation, the seduction, the gradual erosion of what makes you distinct, what makes you specifically yourself, what connects you to the covenant God made with you. 24,000 dead, not from Moabite weapons, but from choosing to go where they were invited and do what everyone else was doing. That is not an ancient danger. That is the danger of Tuesday afternoon. The Moabite women at Baal of Peor didn't say, "Come worship a demon god and die in a plague." They said, "Come eat with us. Come celebrate. Don't be so separate. Don't be so rigid." And the men of Israel went, and the fat of the offering closed over the blade before they even understood what was happening. There is also the story of Ruth, which the book of Ruth itself is at pains to make sure we do not miss. The nation of Moab does not determine the destiny of any individual within it. Ruth walked away from Chemosh. She walked away from everything familiar. She chose Naomi's God in the middle of grief and poverty, with no earthly advantage to gain from it. And she became the great-grandmother of a king, and according to Matthew's genealogy, An ancestor of the one her descendants had sacrificed their children hoping to reach. A king eternal, a peace that Chemosh could never give them. That is the difference between the gods you choose and the God who chooses you. And finally, the Moabite stone. That black basalt slab in the Louvre in Paris. Mesha carved it to make Chemosh famous. He dragged the sacred objects of Yahweh before Chemosh's face and recorded it in stone for all the world to see. 3,000 years later, scholars study the Moabite stone to understand the Bible better. The stone exists as evidence for the biblical record. The objects of Yahweh are not forgotten. The victories Mesha celebrated turned to dust. The god Mesha insulted still fills more libraries than any other subject in human history. There is something deeply poetic about that. A man who tried to make his God look powerful by humiliating Yahweh and ended up, 3,000 years later, contributing to the evidence that the God of Israel was real, while his own God is remembered only as a footnote in archaeology textbooks. You can drag the sacred objects before your idols. You can build high places in sight of Jerusalem. You can burn whatever you think will activate the power you're looking for. But the God who calls himself I Am does not compete with Chemosh. He outlasts him. He outlasts all of them. The Moabites are gone. Chemosh is gone. The land remains. The people who carry their blood remain, unknowing. And in Jeremiah 48:47, a promise remains, even for them, in the latter days. That is where the story of Moab ends, not in the silence of an empty altar, not in the smoke of a burning child on a city wall, but in a word spoken over them, even in judgment, restoration. In the latter days, declared by the only God who can make that promise and keep it. If this video opened something new for you, if you found yourself seeing these ancient people as more than a footnote, please share it. Send it to someone who loves history, who loves scripture, who has ever wondered what happened to the nations the Bible talks about. Your share reaches people I never could. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. There is so much more of this world to uncover together. The next video waiting for you will take you somewhere just as unexpected. It's right there at the end of this screen. I'll see you there.